I'm Martha Broad. I'm the Executive Director at the MIT Energy Initiative, and I want to welcome you to our Earth Week Colloquium, and the topic is Decarbonizing Massachusetts. MIT Energy Initiative is really pleased to be hosting Senator Mike Barrett. We are the hub for energy research, education, and outreach at MIT, and we're working with many parties around the globe, sprinting towards decarbonizing our global energy system. And of course, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is playing a really important role. Little Massachusetts is really helping lead in the US, along with a couple other states, like a little one called California. And Mike is really a key figure in that whole effort. He has been a leader for a number of years on climate. He represents Lexington, Massachusetts. He's the chair of the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy in the state Senate, and handles climate policy for the Senate. He's also Assistant Senate Majority Leader. So he, over the past 2 years, has passed that many major climate bills in the Senate, along with some help from his other representatives and senators. 2021 was an act creating a next-generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, otherwise known as the Roadmap Act. And this is really, keeping the state going towards ratcheting down emissions, and it's really an important requirements for the state to issue reports really proving that they're doing this, et cetera. And then the next year, 2022, was an act driving clean energy and offshore wind, the DRIVE Act. So at the end of his talk, I will be asking him a couple of questions, but I invite all of you to also just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you and you can be part of the conversation also. So thank you very much. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you,
You're
Martha.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I begin, I want to introduce the Director of Research for the Senate side of the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy, and Audrey Horst, MIT grad. Make sure that we're thinking straight about these things. I want to thank the Institute, the university, and in particular, Tom Melville and Kelly McGinnity for setting me up today and for inviting me. I do want to make note of the fact that Saturday is Earth Day. I mean, the reverence for the planet on which we live is obviously the backdrop against which all these activities involving climate change have to unfold. So I thank MIT for exalting the issue and inviting me here. I see a number of friends and advisors and appreciate their coming. I depend a lot on MIT for testing ideas, refining them. So I'm here really to express my appreciation. I want to talk about Massachusetts climate policy. There are 40 state senators in the upper body of the Massachusetts legislature, 160 state representatives. We're not like Congress, which has Senate-only committees to deal with climate and House-only committees. Here we truly have a kind of collaboration of both branches. So there is a joint committee to wrestle with climate. There are some pluses and minuses to bringing House and Senate members together right from the get-go. There's the advantage of collaboration, ideally of early consensus building, but in truth, things get complicated pretty quickly as well. And then we have the real world intruding on us, and I want to talk about the real world today. And in particular, the impacts really attributable to the invasion of the Ukraine, the breakout of inflation due to a number of factors, the disruption of supply chains in any number of industries, but we're going to talk about clean energy and offshore wind in particular, driven in large part by the pandemic. So lots of new and relatively recent sources of disruption to a decarbonization plan that we had conceived of before just before the pandemic hit with a vengeance. I'm going to talk about today what I'm actually thinking about these days. That's not always advisable, but I'm going to take the chance. And what I'm thinking about is, in fact, the possibility of our falling short, dealing with failing to hit a critical milestone in clean energy as we conceive of the state's drive to reduce greenhouse gases. It's tough to think about failure for the obvious reasons. The stakes with respect to clean energy are very high, and in general, nobody likes to fall short even temporarily. I will confess that there's an additional impetus here. I have kids, and so it is true that you think a lot about your kids and grandkids when you think about climate and you're older. But also, I was asked by the Senate President to own this issue for this legislative body of which I'm a member. So I take the prospect of our falling short in any respect very seriously. Nobody likes to fail, especially on such an important issue, and even if the setbacks are going to be temporary. And then there's the question of communicating to my constituency. I represent 8 communities in total in the state. You don't want to be non-transparent. You don't want to fib when things get held up, but you don't want to be a bummer either. And setting that balance, talking candidly, but in a way that keeps energy up and hope up, is what this is all about, right? Because inevitably, we're going to encounter some difficulties. So, in 2021 and 2022, we passed 2 major bills, as Martha mentioned. I'm just going to mention 3 features. These were very complicated pieces of legislation dealing with all kinds of things, from solar to energy efficiency to transportation. But buildings and clean energy generation were an important component. So, for the first time, and this was in 2021, we defined the end state. It's the same end state that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has defined for the world. It's the end state that President Biden, a year after we did it, defined for the U.S., and that's net zero by 2050, which, as we all know, is only 27 years off. We had borrowed a regime from the state of California before 2021. And it was unsatisfying to a number of us in the Senate, certainly including me. The idea was that you set one big fat number to reduce emissions, and I'm referencing the Global Warming Solutions Act of, well, it was of 2006 for California, and we did our in 2008. You set one big emissions reduction goal, and then you set it every decade, every 10 years. We set an objective, for example, for 2020, and then we looked ahead, or proposed to look ahead to 2030. It seemed to me I could see my fellow legislators taking their eye off the ball. I mean, we have lots of things to distract us this year, in the next 6 months. The idea that we were going to think hard for 10 years about hitting, let's say, a 2030 goal was always improbable, and it was clear when I was there, and I entered the Senate in 2013. It was clear that once every 10 years and aiming for one big fat emissions reduction number wasn't working. So what we did was bring the present a little closer. Every 5 years, we were going to come up with a plan, and this time, not just one big fat number. We were going to segment the Massachusetts economy into 6 parts. And we were going to say, okay, what specifically, from 2020 to 2025, are we going to do about transportation? What specifically are we going to do about commercial, industrial, and institutional buildings, including the buildings on a beautiful campus like this? What are you going to do about residential buildings? What are you going to do about, well, industrial processes? What are you going to do about natural gas infrastructure, a particular concern since we want to move away from dependence on fossil fuels for both electric generation and for heating our houses and buildings? And what are you going to do specifically, and this is what we're talking about today, about generating electricity? So 6 sectors of the economy, limits set every 5 years instead of every 10, focusing the mind. And within the clean energy emissions piece, we prioritized offshore wind. There are lots of advantages that the West Coast has with respect to the East Coast, but offshore wind is not one of them, right? We have two special edges here in Massachusetts. One, we have a very shallow Atlantic coastal shelf. Most of the offshore windmills that are going to get built around the world, I think the figure is roughly 2/3, are going to be built in deep water. So deep that you can't put a fixed foundation down on the ocean floor and still have the windmills above the ocean waves spinning. But on the East Coast, and especially in the upper portion of the Atlantic coast, we have a narrow continental shelf on which you can put down a fixed foundation inexpensively. You don't have to have these foundations floating, which is what they're going to have to do in most places in the world. And the second thing is that we have winds that blow more fiercely off our coast than is the case with the Gulf of Mexico or the West Coast. We have very strong winds, and offshore winds, unlike onshore winds, happen to blow in the late afternoon and evening, which is when we tend or anticipate having our peak electricity use. So you want that electricity generating power when you most need it. And once we get in heat pumps and clean up the source of heating for our buildings, we're going to be consuming a lot of electric power late afternoon, early evening, when our winds blow offshore with a vengeance. So you can see why offshore wind became a linchpin, not only to our cleaning up the grid, but to our feeding it into the building system and, for that matter, into transportation through our electric vehicles. Getting these bills passed, moving 10 years down to 5, subdividing the economy into 6 crucial parts, was a pretty dramatic fight. We had a decent governor in Charlie Baker, a moderate Republican, unlike most Republicans nationwide, but he was still moderate. His instincts were to slow things down and to pay special attention to the short-term dislocations that change seemed to pose to business. So in the context of blue Massachusetts, there was a real struggle as we were intent on moving ahead to deal with climate, and the governor was intent on slowing us down and being responsive to his business constituency. The Globe gave very good coverage to the fights that ensued in 2021 and 2022. This is just an example. And the reporter here, Sabrina Shankman of the Boston Globe, was absolutely right. The real estate lobby had a pipeline to Governor Baker. I think he would be the first ones to indicate that they could catch his ear at any point. And they were telling him, slow this legislation down, too aggressive in terms of the 5-year thing, the sublimits, too much specificity, tying us down. And at various junctures, they almost prevailed. The legislature, though, overcame this resistance, and that was important to us. What Massachusetts did need was a customized approach, and here's why. Here's why our thinking had to differ from the thinking of other jurisdictions. Here's a global emissions by sector, and the striking thing to me about the worldwide pie chart on greenhouse gases is how large the agricultural sector looms. Really striking, isn't it? When we were learning this, and my applause, by the way, goes to the poster presentations that are out in that hallway. Students here are doing a terrific job in focusing on water, on energy, but also on food production. Worldwide, agriculture and land use is a real challenge. We've got to get off meat, among other things. But the other thing that strikes you about this particular pie chart, if you're used to thinking stateside about domestic politics, is how small the building sector is worldwide. When you move to the U.S., things start to change. The agricultural sector is reduced by half, from 22% to 11%. A remarkable shift from worldwide emissions to U.S. emissions. And the building sector starts to pop, right? We're looking at about 13% in buildings in the U.S. as opposed to Again, half of that, 6% for the globe. So there's a major shift, which requires, of course, a shift in strategy. Now, take a look at what happens if you're worrying about Massachusetts. Suddenly, and it really is remarkable, the agriculture sector shrinks from worldwide 22% to 0.4% of our emissions. I mean, this is what it means to be in a knowledge-based post-industrial economy. Those are just words. They have real implications. We have some wonderful farming here in western Massachusetts. Actually, we have community farms throughout eastern Mass, too. I noticed there was a poster out there involving an East Boston farm. But fundamentally, both because our agriculture is relatively clean and it's not industrial scale, and because we are a small state, agriculture is 0.4% of our problem. And here's the other thing that is extraordinary to somebody like me who has to wrestle with these things. The building sector now looms very large. If the industrial sector is going to be so small, because again, we're post-industrial, and the agricultural sector is going to be so small, then buildings, transportation, and electric power generation become the whole ballgame, requiring a real focus in terms of our thinking. So we, in a clean energy plan commanded by these 2021 and 2022 statutes, we really insisted on reducing emissions in the energy generation sector. And our primary way to get there, solar is very important, but our primary hope lies with wind, and most of that is offshore. The aim in our climate plan is to reduce emissions attributable to power generation by 53% in 2 short years, and by 70% below our base year, which is 1990, when we get to 2030. So a 70% reduction compared to a base year coming up in 2030. Clean power is critical because the transition in transportation and buildings depend on clean power, and offshore wind is critical to that clean power strategy. Now, there was plenty of reason for Massachusetts to feel very optimistic about offshore wind. This is a busy slide, and you don't have to absorb it. I just want you to take a look at what I've circled. First of all, and these numbers were produced effectively in early 2021, late 2020 for a 2022 report by the U.S. Department of Energy. And you can see that in 2020, 2021, everyone was bullish. Everywhere you looked, even in the short term, the offshore wind sector was bulking out in a very impressive way. This is a bad news, good news story. The good news here is that Europe and the UK pivoted very quickly away from Russian gas. It's really been a remarkable transformation, which bodes very well for worldwide strategies liberating from fossil fuels. But there is an implication for early movers like Massachusetts, early movers by American standards. If the whole world pivots away from Russian gas and intensifies its focus on offshore wind, and the supply, all the supplies you need, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, haven't caught up with this accelerated demand, you're going to have all kinds of complicated problems. So the good news is that Europe decided to, and managed very quickly to come up with a strategy to get off gas. The rest of the news is that those of us who were counting on offshore wind suddenly had a lot of competition for the expertise, the equipment, and the materials. Here we can brag a little bit. Massachusetts is 44th of the 50 states in terms of land mass. We're a tiny little place. We think we're big because we're next to even a tinier place, Rhode Island, but really we're 44th out of 50 states. In terms of population, we're 15th, so not one of the big 10. Small in terms of land size, relatively well, in the middle of the pack in terms of population, and yet we are second, or were second, still are, in the United States in terms of plans to deploy offshore wind. California is number 4. You can see there, remember, its winds don't blow as fiercely, and the windmills it's going to put offshore are going to have to be in deep water, and many of them are going to have to float, very expensive, and the technology, at least in American terms, is still being worked out. We took advantage of the shallow Atlantic coastal shelf and our fierce blows, and we're in second place to New York. We have a much smaller population, so per capita, we're actually ahead of New York State. Again, just look at what I've circled here, not this busy U.S. Department of Energy slide. Costs were going down every year. So not only was Massachusetts very dependent on offshore wind, we could look towards a resource which is plentiful off our coast and was declining in cost. And we decided to put our bids out to would-be developers of our resource accordingly. We really focused on price. Now that distinguished us a little bit, by the way, from New York and New Jersey, relatively speaking, more industrial places. They really wanted to see a lot of onshore job creation. We all do, but New York and New Jersey were especially intent on revising a decaying industrial infrastructure. So they agreed to high prices for their consumers, for their families and businesses, but in return, they got promises of a lot of onshore jobs. And the developers were very upfront about this. They were very upfront with me. They said, look, who do you think is going to pay for blue-collar jobs coming out of this industry? Do you think it's not going to come out of our profits? Ratepayers are going to pay for it in terms of their monthly electric bills. So you want a lot of economic activity, which we would otherwise look to Europe to supply. They've got the trained personnel today because there's a lot of offshore wind in the North Sea and off the coast of Scandinavia. We've got some vessels, some know-how. We would import a lot of this from Europe, they said, but if you want us to grow a homegrown industry stateside, your rates are going to have to go up because that's something we wouldn't do otherwise as quickly as you'd like us to do it. Massachusetts made a different choice than New York and New Jersey. We decided to keep costs down, and they seem to be coming down. As it happens, New England has the highest electric rates of anywhere in the United States. So we had good reason to think about all those kilowatt hours we want you to consume when you power your electric T-buses or drive your electric car or use your heat pump in your apartment or your house. We had lots of reasons to wanting to keep the cost down because we want you chewing up a lot of kilowatt hours as we get you off gas as a heating source, oil as a heating source, gas as an electric generating fuel. So we could count, we thought, on economies of scale and price per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour coming down. And then came 2022, 2023, and all our assumptions were upset, right? Here's just one example. This is an article talking about the surge in worldwide demand for offshore wind. Again, remember, partially a pivot away from Russian gas. Suddenly, worldwide, there weren't enough installation vessels to hold these very heavy components that have to be brought out to sea from wherever the onshore marshaling port is. There are a limited number of these vessels capable of carrying these huge pieces of infrastructure in the world. And in the wake of stepped up demand from Europe, but also from New England and other places, China, there was an enormous shortage of appropriate vessels. These are highly specialized boats. They're enormous. And they have to be built to service this industry anew because there just aren't enough. This is a good problem to have if you work for Clarkson's Renewables, as the author of this piece did. He was celebrating the explosion in demand. It even caught them by surprise. But catching your supplier by surprise with demand for its product is a problem if you're on the other end. So here we have Ørsted, one of the major developers of offshore wind. And I'm just going to read the last sentence in this quote off to the right. In a call with analysts, Ørsted executives said that the write-down of an investment they happened to have in a New York offshore wind project, a proposed one, stemmed from the fact that it had not secured a contract with an installation vessel to build the project in question, had not secured the services of one of these relatively rare, now highly in demand installation vessels, and as a consequence, the entire project now faced uncertain finances because the construction schedules, it seems, can no longer be maintained. And of course, you have rising interest rates driven by the fight against inflation. So even when supplies are available, let's assume that somehow you could figure out how to get a boat. Actually, you need about 20 to 40 vessels per offshore wind farm. Very complicated construction when you're working in the sea as opposed to on land. So even when you get them, what are the prices? This is a report on the uptick in costs for constructing an offshore wind farm. The years covered are 2019 through 2022. Total projected increase due to inflation of 20%. And this is compared to the costs that were built into projects that Massachusetts, New York, and other places had contracted for. This was an unexpected 20%. I can tell you that in our state, for example, the companies I'm about to talk about had priced the product for Massachusetts in September 2021 dollars. Most of this uptick in 20% happened after September of 2021 and posed a major threat to the economics these developers had worked out. There was an increase in cost of vessel, inflation, we just talked about that. Commodities, so we're talking here about the metals that go into making a turbine and an offshore structure. 11% estimated increase in inflation over what had been anticipated even months before. And if you're wondering what the 11% is attributable to, 90% of it is steel, a worldwide commodity which was as sensitive to the uptick in inflation as any. We haven't even talked about financing costs, what you would borrow from the bank to pay for the steel. Now you've got to borrow enough from your financiers, if you're a builder of an offshore wind farm, to cover the uptick in costs, and at a time of inflation, and at a time, of course, when interest rates on your borrowing have suddenly gone up more than any of us anticipated 36 short months ago. So the ramifications of these kinds of disruptions are obviously have been felt worldwide. The Hornsea project off the coast of the UK is the largest proposed offshore wind farm in the world. Again, it happens to be built or had been proposed by Ørsted, a major developer who's also active in Massachusetts. And I'll mention why I'm focusing on Ørsted in a moment. But what Ørsted explained here is that it could no longer proceed with the project on which the UK was depending and is depending without tax breaks to defray costs that no one involved, either the buyer or the seller, the developer or the off-taker, or the country, the UK, none of them had anticipated the costs that we're now talking about, and so they needed a bailout, basically, or the project wasn't going to go forward. Here in Massachusetts, we got hit as well. Avangrid, a subsidiary of a Spanish corporation, Iberdrola, told Massachusetts now just about 1 year ago that it was going to do something that hardly ever happens in the business. Avangrid had signed a contract to build about 60 windmills off the coast of Massachusetts and to provide the electricity after it was built at a price that we found agreeable to us. Remember, we wanted to keep price low. We wanted to see some economic activity as a result of Avangrid's proposed project, but we gave them the business. We gave them the business in early 2021 because we liked the price, and we also liked their expertise. This was not their first rodeo. Nevertheless, they basically informed Massachusetts, and this is an article that appeared just last month. They informed Massachusetts that they were terminating a contract they had signed. They were risking significant reputational damage. Nobody likes to become known for backing out of a deal that it had committed to. And they also, but they indicated that, I should say, that they were willing to pay financial penalties. There are liquid, I'm an attorney, so I can tell you that when these kinds of complicated contracts are negotiated, there are provisions for financial penalties if you welch on your commitment. Even so, the math persuaded Avangrid that it should announce that it wasn't going to perform, that it would pay the penalty, that it hoped for understanding given these worldwide disruptions that we've been talking about, but that in any event, it was not going to go forward. Now, this is about 1,200 megawatts of power. This was a big part of our overall clean energy strategy. And Avangrid's announcement, which was public, was followed in relatively short order by a second developer who kept a lower profile in terms of its intentions. The second developer let it be known that if Avangrid walked away, it was going to walk away. That was a second 1,200 megawatts. This stuff adds up if you're doing clean energy policy. This was the second developer had also committed to a price point that Massachusetts found very appealing given our strategic objectives. And the second developer is also going to non-perform. Or so it appears. This isn't Avangrid's announcement is public. I think the second party is going to follow in very short order. It's the last paragraph here that I want you to really focus on because it's there's a sentence that sums up the dilemma that I'm describing. In the fall, Commonwealth Wind, that's Avangrid, officials said that increases in commodity prices, rising interest rates, and supply shortages mean that the project, quote, cannot be financed and built under the terms of those contracts. That's a flat statement that isn't unheard of in the business world, but it's pretty rare. And it's not good news if you're making climate policy for Massachusetts. I do want to emphasize that we haven't officially failed yet in terms of meeting our emissions reductions goals for clean energy because, as you'll recall, we brought the focus in tight from every 10 years to every 5, but the emissions reductions goal for clean energy generation, electricity generation that we're looking for is a goal to be attained by 2025. So we're technically haven't failed yet. In theory, we have 2 years to reclaim and recover from the setbacks that I'm describing, but still, it's very clear. It's very clear once you drill down on the numbers that the consequences are there for the schedule that we've set to reduce our emissions. Remember, 2025 is key, but 2030 is if anything, even more important. It has symbolic importance worldwide and throughout the U.S. and in Massachusetts. 2030 is a pivotal year as we build toward 2050. It now seems quite likely, if we can't clean the grid, and if the electricity running through our EVs and our heat pumps is dirtier than we anticipated, it is quite likely that we're not going to hit our 2025 and 2030 benchmarks. And that brings the question back to how do you deal with missing milestones? I can tell you that an ideal option, and maybe it will fall into our hands, is that somehow we find a way specifically of putting the offshore wind deployment schedule back on schedule. That seems highly unlikely. We don't have a set of new players. There's a complicated protocol here. The feds control the waters beyond 3 miles, and these offshore windmills are off the coast much longer than 3 miles. So there's a federal auction that takes place before a state steps in and contracts with an offshore wind developer. In this particular case, only 5 companies own the rights to develop those federal waters beyond the waters that state government formally controls. Avangrid and this second developer I haven't named are 2 of the 5 operators, right? Ørsted, which we've talked about in connection with their disappointments in the North Sea, is one of the remaining 3 players. So we've got problems with our current developers. The source of competition, if we have to rebid all these contracts and start from scratch, the source of the competition is still limited to only 5 players who own those federal lease areas, the rights to develop them, I should say. And Ørsted is a major player there and is having problems of its own. So we're not going to be rescued by a Deus ex machina, a hidden hand extending itself and saving us. The universe of potential players is just too small. Ideal option number 2, of course, in dealing with the crisis that we find ourselves in, would be to find an alternative source of clean energy. And primarily these, well, you could think about onshore wind. There is some onshore wind up in Maine, but we've already contracted for it. That's already factored into our plans. You could talk about hydro. We've got a major project, we hope, bringing hydroelectric power down from Canada through Maine to Massachusetts, but the Maine voters have thrown up some roadblocks which we may or may not overcome. And of course you've got solar. But I can tell you, and it's going to complicate the jobs of those of you interested in solar power, resistance is building very quickly in Massachusetts, really throughout the country, but certainly in Massachusetts, toward ground-mounted solar that takes up open space, in some cases involves cutting down trees. The Not in My Backyard movement, but it's also an environmental and open space movement, has split the Environmental and Clean Energy community right down the middle. So deploying a whole bunch of additional ground-mounted solar on Massachusetts open space that isn't already contracted for, that's not going to happen. The politics of deploying solar have become complex. So when the ideal options aren't available, what do? You have to move to Plan B. This has been a struggle for me. I've already mentioned to you. One, I hate to see us fall off the pace in any way. I was worried. I think I've worked my way through this, but I was worried about the consequences. And then, since this is my portfolio, this is what I do for policy for my legislative body, I hate to preside over a setback. Still, what would Plan B look like? I've had to ask myself this just in the last several weeks, because I anticipate everything we're talking about now, much of it's public information. The questions haven't been asked by the press, but they're going to be asked, I think, as soon as the next week or so. And then my constituents and my colleagues in the legislature will ask the same questions, which is, what do we do now? I've decided that although the temptation is very strong to keep everything under your hat and somehow hope for a savior or a saving idea to appear, I've decided that one has to be relatively straightforward about this, which is why I'm talking to you all today. 2 weeks ago, we hired a new general manager for our MBTA, another major governmental system or enterprise in crisis. And this guy has decided, not that he has too many choices, he feels, but he's decided to be very upfront. He's saying, look, we're going to talk about the problems we've got openly, and we're going to talk about how we're going to solve them. We're not going to just keep silent and hope that you don't notice. It's hard not to notice the malfunctioning at the T. Very soon, it'll be hard to not to notice the setbacks that we're seeing with respect to deploying offshore wind. But we do want to provide perspective, right? And losing perspective in a moment of disappointment is something easy to do. It takes a while to regain it. You know, the truth is that a short delay, and I think we're looking at just a couple of years delay, is a speed bump. It's not a roadblock. It is not the end of climate policy. In fact, worldwide, the demand for offshore wind, remember, is extraordinary. In part, again, driven by the war in Ukraine and the need to get off Russian fossil fuel. Eventually, supply will come into balance with this demand. It doesn't happen instantaneously, which is the problem Massachusetts has now. Too much demand, not enough supply of those installation businesses, of that affordable steel. But the balance will be restored, and it's important to remember that when you're faced with an immediate setback. I do think, though, that we ought to be specific, and I ought to be specific with my constituents about what we're likely facing. This is not the end of climate policy. This is, I think we're going to wind up building every windmill that we need for our emissions reduction policy, just not in the timeline that we had hoped for. We're probably looking at a 2 or 3 year delay. You know, it's interesting, you talk to the economists about what's going to happen with the worldwide economy and the American economy, and they'll tell you, still, as of today, about 60% of economists surveyed will tell you that they do expect the U.S. to enter formally into a recession sometime in the next 12 months. But they also expect it to be a shallow recession, a brief one. There's every reason to think that the American economy and the worldwide economy is going to experience a dip and then come out of it. In part because there's a lot of wealth in the world, there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand, and that supply chain, remember, is going to move up into an equilibrium with the demand. So it's important to be very specific here, I think, about what we're facing, and what we're facing here is being thrown off track by about 2 years. That's not inconsequential. That has real implications for a climate plan written for 2025 and 2030. That exists on paper. Those numbers in that 2030 plan need to be revised. We probably need a post-pandemic, post-inflation, post-Ukraine rewrite, and there's no talk of that yet. But the numbers that still exist as a consequence are off and aren't doing anybody any good, really. I've learned a lesson, though, from the surprising appearances of these forces. I have decided that straight talk should not depend on an individual politician like me opting for a particular course of action. We really need to institutionalize transparency. There's a risk. Some of this news can be discouraging. You don't know how your voting public is going to react. That's why the first instinct is always to stay quiet. I don't care if you're heading up a major university, a major corporation, or a state or federal government. You don't want to be the bearer of bad news. It has real consequences, potentially, for your tenure or for the popularity in which you're held. The only way, nevertheless, to get key information out to people, you have to trust them, is to somehow look beyond the valor of independent elected officials or university leaders or CEOs. So I've submitted legislation this year with Audrey Horst's help, which would create a new climate policy commission for Massachusetts. Now, we would not usurp any of the policy-making functions of the current executive branch. We wouldn't change the regulatory missions of some of these important state agencies, nor would we change the legislative role, which would remain with 200 legislators, 40 senators, 160 reps. But what we would do is create a truly independent body to examine the numbers and to speak truth to power. And to institutionalize it. Now, we have these independent agencies. I can tell you, for example, that we have a Massachusetts Ethics Commission. The Ethics Commission isn't accountable to the governor because the governor may be the one, at least in theory, who could behave unethically. So how do you set up a truth teller in the case of ethics, meaning you don't take money or gifts from private folks hoping to influence public policy? You do that by finding institutional ways to set up an ethics commission that isn't accountable in a serious fashion to the governor or to the legislature. That's the kind of climate policy commission I'm proposing here. And its job would be, these are certain provisions in the bill that Audrey and I have written. The commission shall be an independent public entity, not subject to the supervision or control of any other executive office. And what will be its mission? Tracking and assessing public and private sector progress, or the lack thereof, towards meeting any and all limits, sublimits, benchmarks, goals, milestones, whatever you want to call them. The idea is to provide a good check on the numbers so that people like me aren't in control of the timing of the disclosure of bad news. And leaving me aside, you don't want a governor, a mayor, a corporate CEO, a university president in control of this information, not when the public interest is at stake and not when the bias has to be in favor of arming the public with critical information. And then finally, as I've sort of pondered what to do here and thought about how we deal with bad news, I was impressed with this guy. He's probably being overly modest, wouldn't you say? But he makes a good point, which is that the setbacks, the obstacles in the way of your solving any problem, whether it's the theory of relativity or the problem of climate change, the setbacks are going to happen. This is not going to be a smooth transition in which the slope of reduced emissions continues absolutely unabated without any alteration along the way. This is a tough, tough job. And whatever we think is going to happen in the real world, well, the real world is going to surprise us. So persistence really is critical. You know, if it's 90% sweat equity and only 10% intellectual brain power, something like that, I think Albert Einstein has something to teach us. So I want to thank you all for hearing me out here. And I want to thank the MIT Energy Initiative for sponsoring this conversation today. Thank you. And here comes Martha.
With a couple questions. So, well, this was great. And I'm especially impressed by the last piece, the commission that's going to keep an eye on things. And, you know, I'm thinking to myself as you're talking, like, all right, so you missed the 2025 deadline. What can the state do to make up the time? And clearly, the state's already trying to, you know, we're talking about the supply being dirtier than we had hoped it would be by 2025. So, you know, the state's already trying to do this, but what about electrifying everything? I mean, I guess I have questions about electric vehicles and how do we move faster there? I feel, you know, perhaps the IRA has made things a little more complicated.
Well, I mean, there is some good news. It's hard to adjust to bad news. It's even difficult to assimilate good news into your views. I'm amazed at how, at the turnaround just in the last 12 months in EV talk. And I'm talking about chatter, sort of in the economy. Every major car company has suddenly decided that it's got to electrify double time. We didn't see that coming 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Some of it, I think, predates the Inflation Reduction Act, but a lot of it is obviously fueled by Joe Biden. I can tell you that I've been doing this climate stuff long enough so that I remember, and it was really only 2 or 3 years ago, when those of us who were interested in this stuff, including folks here at MIT who were working on it, were viewed as do-gooders. It didn't quite compute economically. The numbers didn't quite work out. Anybody interested in this field was primarily altruistic. That's changed. I can tell you, and I've seen it happen especially with offshore wind, this is big, big money. The good news, I think it's good news, is that greed is being harnessed to greening the planet. And the companies playing here know that they can make a buck. And that's why I know that this setback with respect to offshore wind is going to be temporary, because it is amazing, if you read the trade press, how many folks are lining up convinced that they can make a very good living saving the earth. I think that is good news, and it keeps me optimistic despite the occasional irritations along the way.
So what are we doing in the state in terms of charging stations? I mean, I had to make a decision. I bought a plug-in hybrid.
You did, congratulations.
Yeah, well, because I live out in the burbs where there aren't many charging stations, and I just wasn't ready to pay.
Where do you live?
I live in Bolton.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So,
nice
so
town.
what's the state doing to?
Well, again, I think you're going to see an amazing change. You can read the press from 6 months ago, and it looks like we're doing nothing, and that range anxiety is going to rule. There, I do give the President of the United States a lot of credit.
Yeah.
The tax incentives, the deals are so sweet. 60% of the cost of your building a major clean energy facility, including a network of charging stations, can now be offset, 60% of your cost, by the tax breaks you're going to get. I mean, this is a big, big deal. But even before Biden did his thing, and it was a game changer, the DPU, which has been a foot dragger here, we haven't talked about our realignment of state agencies, but we did realign the missions of all of them, the Department of Public Utilities included. But the DPU, 6 months before Biden acted, did issue an order to Eversource and National Grid, also providing a financing, a money stream, so they're going to be deploying all kinds of chargers. So you've got the private utilities seeing it as a business opportunity. You've got the president really sweetening the deal. This, again, ought to be big bucks, right? Even, and by the way, 3 days ago, I took delivery on my first EV.
All right.
Not a Tesla, not a Tesla. I didn't want Elon Musk, no offense to those who own Teslas, but I didn't want to fatten his wallet on my watch. So my wife and I bought a EV6, a Kia.
Yeah.
It's going to take 5 or 6 years for it ever to qualify for Joe Biden's 7,500. But we're very pleased with the car. And it's good to get some of the non-Teslas out there on the Massachusetts roads, don't you think?
I'm in total agreement, but we won't go there right now. We won't talk
Yes.
about Twitter and
He's probably going to be
NPR
a
and
Musk building on campus appearing any day now, so I don't want to...
So let's switch to another consumer, opportunity, which is heat pumps. And actually, I've been looking into that myself. We won't go into a lot of detail right now. Unless you're a heat pump installer, you can see me afterwards. But so how do we get that going faster? And also developers, we're building new housing stock every day. How do we incent them to put electrified heat in to begin with?
We talked to Harvey Michaels.
That's right.
Where Harvey is Harvey still here? Harvey is working on this issue, and Chris Knittel, two MIT luminaries, are working hard, and I rely on them for as sources of advice. But I can tell you, so buildings, you don't recall this from the previous slide, but transportation is 43% of the Massachusetts problem. Buildings are 37%. Yep. So we have to deploy heat pumps, and if you're on natural gas, then 52% of Massachusetts buildings are heated with natural gas, made impractically cheap because of fracking, with all its environmental implications. So effectively, subsidized natural gas undercuts the economics of heat pumps. And we can do several things. One is to sweeten the deal on heat pumps. What Professor Michaels is working on actually is a proposal that we can put before our state DPU to reduce the cost per kilowatt hour of the electricity you would consume to run your heat pump. It can be complex, but I want to compliment Professor Knittel and Professor Michaels for tooling away at that. And I think we're going to solve that one because we have to, right? But it's not easy. Natural gas, not oil. 32% of our buildings are oil heated. Oil is expensive enough, and propane are expensive enough so that we can give you a good deal on a heat pump right now. You'll save some money. But the natural gas heated home or business is the challenge that Massachusetts has to confront by reworking our electric rate system.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that should help. Yeah, I'm actually a natural gas. I guess I'm a do-gooder then if I'm switching over to heat pump, from natural gas. But, I think it's interesting because having read the state's climate plan, people have to eventually do it. So let's talk about transmission. Let's go back to offshore wind. And you mentioned the transmission line that the Maine voters, basically for now put the kibosh on, although I think there's a court case coming. I think that's...
Are you talking about the Maine?
Yeah.
So actually the trial concluded, I think, today.
Oh, okay.
The voters of Maine, we used to own Maine, by the way.
They've forgotten that, clearly.
Yes, they have forgotten their roots. The voters of Maine, a separate state, but only since 1820, voted down this transmission line routing electric power from Hydro-Quebec to the Massachusetts border. But then the Maine Supreme Court declared that if a key fact can be found by a jury, that referendum result can be overturned. The key fact is whether Avangrid, and again we happen to be talking about Avangrid, which is building the transmission line, in good faith put in so much money to building that transmission that voters coming along later to nullify it, that nullification can't hold. The jury issue, the Supreme Court read the law and decided what was fair, but then they said to a Maine jury, convene and decide whether Avangrid really did all that construction work, about $400 million worth, in good faith. Not just to game out the situation, but really expecting that they were going to be able to move forward, only to be thwarted. The jury has heard testimony from witnesses for Avangrid saying, look, we didn't put in all this money just to position you. We really thought we had a project here. The other side, and here's the way politics really works, the other side is fronted by environmental groups like including the Sierra Club in Maine, bankrolled by the owner of the Seabrook nuclear plant, Next Era. Next Era sees a threat to the pricing of nuclear power, clean, coming from hydro, clean, but at a lower price point. So the owner of the power plant put up the money so that environmental groups, which have their own concerns with cutting down, with creating a corridor down western Maine, put up the money, and the jury, and there are 12 jurors sitting this week, listening to Avangrid argue that it acted in good faith, listening to expert witnesses for Next Era saying, no, this is all gaming the system. And those 12 folks will decide if we get that hydro coming through Maine. That's democracy for you, a pretty dramatic moment.
Yeah, definitely. So I just want to pause and invite anybody who has questions. Great. I don't want to...
Yeah, good evening. Thanks, Senator Mike, for being here and for your presentation. I'm Rajan. I'm from India. I'm taking a course on energy here, and I'm glad our two instructors are also sitting here. When you talk about the escalation in the input cost of offshore wind industry, is the state of Massachusetts thinking about giving a retrospective and perspective credits on production and tax to specifically windshore producers? And if the cost is increasing, levelized cost of energy is increasing, how is it panning out in transmitting it in the power purchase agreements? They can, of course, recover a part of their cost by increasing the power purchase agreements. And third question was that I was glad to see that despite its small size, you are number 2 in US in offshore wind energy generation. How have you handled the biodiversity concerns and concerns from the fishing community and environmental concerns? Thank you.
Well, first of all, with regard to tax breaks or financing help extended by the state, I can tell you that President Biden has changed the game in a good way. And it's with respect to financial help extended to these developers. And it's what gives me hope that the bump in the road we're facing is not a roadblock, but a delay. What he did was take some federal tax credits, which had to be renewed every couple of years. One of the deals he negotiated with Joe Manchin took this federal tax credit setup, which can be, again, very lucrative if you're a builder, and he extended it for 10 years. The horizon it takes to put one of these huge windmill farms into the ocean, that extension of the federal tax credits could, I hope, offset a lot of these short-term financial difficulties that I've been talking about with this slide deck. It doesn't mitigate all of them, but it significantly changes the calculus. Now, on the state side, we created some tax breaks as well, but here I'm a progressive Democrat, and here we encountered a tension. We've all tended, you're always asked to create tax expenditures, basically tax loopholes, you could call them, in a moment when doing so seems very compelling. So giving away tax breaks to corporations which are huge billion-dollar enterprises and which do stand to make a lot of money for 20 years from Massachusetts ratepayers, giving them additional financial breaks is a serious question. We always, the proponents for those breaks, lobbyists essentially who come to the legislature to make the case for their clients, always want you to write the language loosely. The idea is that you start out saying, well, okay, let's give a tax break if you contribute, if you're really building the offshore wind supply chain in Massachusetts. If you're a company that's going to put a cable firm in Massachusetts, those huge cables have to take all the electricity from offshore and bring them to onshore. If you're going to do that, we'll give you a tax break. The language in the beginning always begins by the lobbyists saying, we want you to give away the farm. We want you to write loosey-goosey language, not limited to identifiable components of a supply chain, but really anything that smacks of a tangentially related business enterprise. We want them qualified for the tax breaks too. In this case, in Massachusetts, at my insistence, we wrote the language very tightly. If you are, in fact, going to put down, if you're going to reshore, if you're going to bring something from offshore, from the UK and Scandinavia, and create an indigenous Massachusetts supply chain for offshore wind, we will give you the break. But you're going to have to persuade us that you're part of that kind of game. All the loosey-goosey stuff, which essentially would give the executive branch the right to throw tax loopholes at every damn company that comes down the pike who claims to be, for example, you don't want a major bank in Boston to create a special offshore wind financing subsidiary and say, give us a break from the corporate income tax. We're part of the supply chain. Too many games can be played, so we've written a pretty tight statute. I'm not going to try to answer all three of your questions because I want to get back to Martha. I will say that we are working very closely with the fishing industry, which was your third question. And there is a lobstering and fishing industry here that's in danger for all kinds of other reasons. The waters off our coast are getting very warm. The lobsters have already migrated to Maine, and they're going right up the coast. So that's real, and we do have to make sure that we don't exacerbate the situation. So there, we are trying to be very careful.
Great.
Sorry, Martha.
No, that's absolutely fine. So, okay, I'm going to keep calling on the audience. I have more questions, but I'm going to give them a turn. There's actually a woman in the back, and then the gentleman in the orange. So.
Hello, Solène from MIT. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I guess I have a question about indirect emissions. You mentioned that the state of Massachusetts can be described as a post-industrialized and knowledge-based state, and so as such there are almost zero emissions associated with the industry sector and the agriculture sector. But surely people, eat, they consume commodities, or they use services that themselves relies on commodities. And so is there a plan as part of the strategy of the state of Massachusetts to decarbonize the state to include or at least consider these indirect emissions?
Could you just summarize that question?
I wish I could. Maybe you could stand up. Indirect emissions, I heard.
Yes, I was just trying to say that, as consumers, we can emit directly emissions by, driving a car, but we can also emit indirect emissions. For example, if I eat a steak, by eating that steak, I would not emit anything, but the producer will have emitted emissions. And so my question is, as part of the strategy of the Massachusetts to decarbonize the state, are you trying to think about these indirect emissions to help other states?
It's a great question, yeah.
Thank you, sorry.
Well, it is an excellent question, and I can tell you that the thinking 2 years ago, I would have said, no, we haven't taken indirect emissions into effect. Measuring them and figuring out whose responsibility they are is tough, right? You've got, let's take offshore wind, let's take the blades. The blades, by the way, for these constructs are longer than an American football field. I mean, the blades that stand on the stocks whirring around are enormous, and you need specialized boats for those. So 2 years ago, we would just have thought about the contribution that an offshore windmill would make to reducing our emissions. But now we really focused on low-carbon material substitutes. Material sciences really has finally found an audience with us. We don't have a policy yet to reduce emissions from our procurement of out-of-state materials. But the day, I think, is rapidly coming. Working out the math, and again, figuring out what emissions reduction Massachusetts could claim for buying a low-carbon windmill blade is going to be tough, because the manufacturer of that blade, it could be somewhere else in the United States, it could be somewhere overseas, is also going to be interested in reducing emissions and claiming the credit for having done so. The accounting that goes on in figuring out offshore emissions reductions is challenging, but people are working on that. People at this institution, I'm sure, are working on it. And the day is coming when all of us are going to engage. So thank you for raising the question.
All right, and there's somebody right here, and maybe you could just wave to her so she knows who you are. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator, for your presentation. Regarding all these questions, sorry, it's weird to hear myself from here. Okay. Regarding all these questions, do you consider the standards of living of people of Massachusetts negotiable?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Do you consider the standard of living of people of Massachusetts negotiable?
Is the standard of living of the people of Massachusetts negotiable?
Give me an example of what you're concerned about potentially.
Like when you do something, you are using some energy, and for now, this energy is...
hold up the mic, I'm sorry.
And now, when you do something, when you do an action, now it's like when you move yourself, you use a carbon source of energy. And if you don't have the capacity to change your source of energy, maybe you won't be able to do this action again. And so my question is regarding climate change, etc. Do you consider in Massachusetts the standard of living of people, the capacity of action of people negotiable? Thank you.
Well, I don't know who one would... I don't know who one would negotiate it with. I can tell you this. There's a very active environmental justice movement in Massachusetts, so I'm not sure this is the crux of your question, but we're very concerned about people who don't have the money to immediately opt onto something cleaner. We're very concerned, for example, with the high price of EVs. And part of this climate bill that I haven't talked about today, for example, would we sweeten the deal on purchasing an EV, and we increase the dollar amount, the incentive you'd get when you buy an electric vehicle. But if you buy a used EV, and people with lower incomes probably might have to look at the used car market first, you get an additional incentive because we're trying to help folks who don't have a lot of money. At the same time, we're also looked at the MBTA, remember, and we decided that we had to clean up their emissions because they go through a lot of urban neighborhoods. People who can't even afford cars take the MBTA bus system in particular. So we put the MBTA under a mandate to buy only zero-emission vehicles for their bus fleet beginning in 2030. And there's a reason why we waited that long. You need all kinds of chargers, obviously, for buses before you can buy EVs. And the bus barns run by the T are completely diesel dependent. We need to give them time to rebuild the stations where the buses park overnight. Every single bay has to have a charger. And that turns out to take, those building projects turn out to take quite a while. So we gave the T until 2030, but after that, every lease and every purchase of a bus has to be of a non-polluting nature. So we're trying to make sure that poor folks are not disadvantaged by our transition to green energy. I'm not sure, though, that I'm addressing the question you have in mind.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay, that's
All
good.
right, thank you.
Todd.
Hello. Thank you for presenting today. I'm Todd Hines. I teach a course called Climate and Energy Ventures at MIT. And my question has to do about the systems benefit charge, which Massachusetts has been implementing for several years. It's probably one of the most successful programs in terms of supporting energy efficiency. And it doesn't specifically support specific technologies, right? They take the money in, and the driver is really reducing kilowatt hours used. It doesn't say how you have to do that. It supports that. And I understand there's been an initiative to change that to reducing CO2 intensity, which opens up things like heat pumps or EVs, which might increase kilowatt hours, but also be reducing emissions. So my question is about that incentive or that initiative. Has that been successful? Has it been moving forward? And then a little side question around, might be a big side question, around transportation, given the size of the pie. Is there been any discussion about adding a systems benefit charge to a gallon of gasoline, using those funds to support reducing transportation emissions, not necessarily EVs, any technology, or even carpooling or better public transit or anything like that? Thank you.
Two good questions. With regard to your first question, this effort to reorient the Department of Public Utilities and the way that it looks at gas rates and electric rates was a big focus of my office and the work that Audrey and her colleagues who work for me do. We entered some language into this very complicated statute that has to do with the way the DPU functions. And you're right, energy efficiency for years was the watchword and was the word until 2021 in Massachusetts. And energy efficiency at first blush is closely related to emissions reduction. But as you know, there's a critical difference. For years, in our state energy efficiency programs, we rewarded you for upgrading your oil furnace to a newer oil furnace, which tended to be more efficient and on balance reduced emissions somewhat, but really used fewer kilowatt hours, fewer BTUs to keep you warm. And but you stayed on oil. We created incentives and gave them out for years to upgrade your gas furnace, but you'd stay on natural gas. What we did in redrafting the statute was require that the social value of greenhouse gas emissions be considered in setting gas and electric rates. And to my shock, it took us a long time to come up with the language. We had to look at the professional literature. Effectively, we set a price on carbon and required that it be a part of rate setting. And I was stunned at how quickly the DPU pivoted, and even the utilities. They took a look at our Mass Save program, focused on energy efficiency. You can stay on fossil fuels just upgrade your systems. And we suddenly asked them to consider getting off fossil fuels completely and considering the social value of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And they said it was a game changer. It changed the day-to-day conversations that regulators had. Related to this, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but these state agencies throughout the world, even the ones having to do with energy policy, have been surprisingly reluctant to think about climate change. Everyone likes to do the job she or he was doing last year. Nobody likes to retool their thinking. So our energy regulators were used to focusing on the reliability of electricity and on prices. And the DPU very proudly on its website said until last year, that's what we do, folks. Reliability and affordability. We gave the DPU a new mission. We said, look, you can't just think about two things, you've got to think about six. You certainly have to think about things like equity, which relates to the earlier question. How are your rates landing on people who can't afford to pay much? But you also specifically have got to think about reducing emissions. DPU, you don't have a two-pronged mission anymore. You've got one that's you are an emissions reduction agency. And when the legislature changed the DPU's mission, it had the same effect as our moving the energy efficiency definition off affordability and reliability and onto emissions reduction. It seemed to be the difference between night and day. So that's all the good news. Now, you asked about transportation and whether we could levy a charge on gasoline. I can tell you that I am an evangelist for carbon pricing, economy-wide. And although it isn't talked about much, in these climate bills, quietly, we managed to give the executive branch the option to institute a revenue-neutral carbon fee. And here's why we couldn't do a carbon tax revenue positive for this reason. Our state constitution requires that the Massachusetts House of Representatives initiate tax programs, not the governor and not the state Senate. So we had a constitutional problem with going positive and collecting money off transportation, putting in a pot to green transportation. But we can authorize, and we did authorize, a revenue neutral fee, which essentially involve you're adding a charge to, it could be gasoline, but you're remitting 100% of it back to the ratepayers after their behavior had been altered, we presume, in the form of a cash rebate. That we can bypass the House of Representatives on. It could be done by the governor, but it's very hard to do. Blue Massachusetts isn't blue enough. The gas tax, for years before the climate debate caught fire, was considered toxic. Deval Patrick, the governor before our recent Republican governor, tried to raise the gas tax considerably and committed to clean energy, among other things. Instead, we raised it something like 1 or 2 pennies. The gas tax is a conservative, right-wing key issue, a wedge issue. And they can beat Democrats and climate progressives if you focus too much on taxing gasoline. I'm just observing. So we've been thwarted there, but the governor, while we're not requiring her to raise a gas tax, could institute a revenue neutral fee. The practical difference is that I would use less gasoline because the price would go up. And that would be true even if I quietly rebated the money back in a check to every household at the end of every calendar year. That behavior would have been affected on the front end. So the governor could do it, but I don't expect her to do it because of the political toxicity anytime soon.
All right, so we've gone way over, but this has been fantastic. And I just want to thank Senator Barrett for coming to us.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll clearly have to have you back again because I have more topics.